and hope for genetic therapies. These investments have waxed and waned over this 50-year period. We've seen some exciting developments, and we've also seen some really kind of devastating disappointments as well. Yet there's persistence. There is an undeniable impact on science and society, which can be regarded as a gene therapy revolution. So UCSD, though, has a special place in the history of this technology, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And this has been a springboard for the Gene Therapy Initiative, which launched here in 2023. Now, I'm the Director of Research Engagement and Operations for the GTI, which you call it for short. And the GTI approached Greg because we wanted to participate in this public conversation and really set aside time to delve into these really meaty questions about ethics, risk, and the future of medicine. So here today are three panelists who we've invited to share their perspectives on these topics. And we've invited the audience here to probe these topics more deeply and to know what you find exciting and cautionary about this technology. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and share with us why they're interested in gene therapy and why they are here today.
Thank you very much. So my name is Reuven Brandt. I am an assistant professor in the philosophy department over here at UCSD. I work in applied ethics and moral theory. One of my main research interests is human reproduction and obligations to children. And of course, as the landscape around genetic modification has changed, that's become more and more relevant to the kind of fundamental questions I'm interested in about what we owe children, how to make children's lives go better, and those kinds of questions. And so I guess that's why I'm interested in this topic and why I'm here today.
I'm Jonathan Grinstein. I'm a North American editor at a magazine called Inside Precision Medicine. I'm a journalist and podcaster. My podcast is called Behind the Breakthroughs. I was a student here in the graduate program of biomedical sciences. I got my PhD in 2017. Had a great time here. It's really amazing to be back. There's always new things popping up, especially the subway or the trolley right here. But I mean, I've always been interested in gene therapy. I cover both the sides of the technology, new developments and innovation, as well as some of the ethical challenges. There's some really interesting questions. Of course, I think a lot of people go into this field wanting to help people, but it's also very important to kind of understand what our conversation is with the public, and that's something I'm also very interested in.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Cherqui, and I'm professor in the Department of Pediatrics at UCSD. My lab focuses on the use of hematopoietic stem cell and gene therapy to cure or treat genetic disorder for which there is no good treatment. Gene therapy has always been my passion. It actually drove my career. I really knew very early on when I was, in high school that I wanted to do gene therapy. So this is really what I'm doing today. This is what I always dreamed that I wanted to do. And actually, I am lucky enough that we really generate a new treatment for a disease called cystinosis, which is rare. And we went from the bench to bedside, and we have now completed the phase 1/2 clinical trial. And now we created a pipeline to extend and treat much more disease.
So with that, we're going to dive into the significant milestones of gene therapy and bring up topics one by one. And I will ask our panelists to comment on these things, but I will also really encourage our audience, as Greg said earlier, to jump into the conversation when there's interest that gets piqued or when you have questions or commentary to add. So please, we really want to make this an interactive session. So I want to reflect really quickly on the journey that we've taken to get here. Gene therapy as a concept has been around since the late 60s, and Dr. Theodore Friedman actually became the first person to propose gene therapy as a concept after him and his colleagues provided the first proof of concept in a disease model for a disease called Leschnaien. It's a rare disease. And he showed that you can introduce a gene, but it was very inefficient. So he spent the rest of his career, mostly here at UC San Diego, actually exploring what different vector gene delivery mechanisms there could be. I wish I could spend time explaining about the different types of technologies here, but that would take a whole session. So I will briefly talk just more about the history, and then if you have more technical questions, feel free to ask the panelists here today. So it would take time, though, from 1968, and I'm not sure, all the numbers are showing a little bit odd here, so apologies for that, for science fiction to take a hold of those ideas, because even though this proof of concept was shown in a laboratory, this helps. So let me put this a little louder. Maybe move my chair. Sorry about that noise. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So it would take a while to take that proof of concept to make it an actual therapy. So in the meantime, Hollywood took over, as they usually do, with their imaginations. And we remember in 1993 was the first movie that came out about cloning and gene editing. So this is where a mosquito had a DNA from a dinosaur. It was incomplete, but they were able to extract it because it had been preserved. And then it was incomplete, and they had to go ahead and use another genome for a related animal, which was a frog. And then with that, they completed the whole genome and magically put it in an ostrich egg, and here we go, we have dinosaurs, right? So that introduced this question of, just because we know how to do it, should we, right? So there's a repercussions for that. Should we do it for a theme park, right, like in Jurassic Park? But then later on in 1997, they kind of delved a little bit deeper into that with a movie called Gattaca. And a Gattaca enthusiast is Dr. Cherqui here. So if you've seen it, please feel free to comment. She'll talk about it for the whole session if you'd let her. So basically, this really explored this idea of designing your children and designing out diseases, designing out frailties, things that society maybe doesn't value, and designing in things that they do value, if that's aesthetics, intellectual, athleticism, and things like that. So this was kind of a little bit scarier version of it in terms of society about this. And so we're playing with the notion of eugenics or selective breeding, right? And this also introduced this social stratification of genetically engineered, what they call valid people, and the ones who didn't have the engineering as the invalids. And keep in mind, because this is science and it does take some while to get there, there was a lot of innovation that needed to be happening before we could develop therapies for patients. And delivery, tools, dosing, and safety. All those things were developing, and it really took a while till 2012. We're talking about almost 4 decades later from that proof of concept, where Glybera was the first drug that was approved in Europe. And this was for a rare disease, and it was for a genetic disease that occurred. And so the issue is that then it took another 5 years for the U.S. to approve Luxturna for inherited blindness. And again, this whole history also has its blights, and one of those, and why it took so long to get there, was the death in 1999 of a trial volunteer named Jesse Gesslinger. And the safety part, they dealt with a lot of different tools, a lot of different vectors to explore what was going to be useful or not, and what was safe or not. But in the meantime, because we now had these breakthroughs, Dr. Ted Freeman was recognized for that initial thought about gene therapy in 2015 and was given the prestigious Japan Prize for medicinal science. And again, he was a researcher here at UCSD and continues to be on different boards and committees. And Dr. Stephanie Cherqui followed him not too later after that prize in 2019 with her first bench-to-bedside therapy, which she explained earlier, for the rare disease cystinosis. And that's quite an accomplishment for someone, with a PhD. She had to put a lot of people together for that. A lot of that was done here at the University Medical Center. A lot of different doctors. This is a multisystemic disease. So a lot of different prodding and making sure that this therapy would actually be safe and effective. And since then, there's around 40 FDA-approved cell and gene therapies. Mind you, these therapies all involve somatic gene editing. So essentially, this is editing where it's very targeted to a particular type of cell. It's edited, and then now, the changes that happen are to those potential cells, and hopefully not having any off-target effects, and definitely not being transmitted to any children in the next generation. Now, germline editing is a whole other issue that has having to do with sperm, egg, or any embryo being changed. And in that particular one, when that introduction is made, all the cells are going to change, and also the children from that person are going to be changed as well. And in 2018, there was kind of some unsanctioned science happening, and there was a manipulation of embryonic stem cells or embryonic cells, and this was using a CRISPR technology, and it introduced some really random unintended changes. And the issue is that there wasn't a knowledge and understanding of the safety. And now fast forward to 2025, and there's still this feeling. So all of the different societies that are involved with cell and gene therapy, the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, the International Society of Cell and Gene Therapy, and the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine met just last month, and they still decided that there really is not enough information and safety knowledge about this. If we're going to change the embryo, we don't know what the off-target effects are going to be, and so we should not give it a green light at all. So with that, I want to stop here on the germline gene editing part of this and kind of go back to that film Gattaca, where it imagines the world of the designer babies. And this recent convening was about safety. But my question is to the panel is, with AI, with other things that are happening, do we see that some of these safety concerns might be addressed soon? And we might be back to this question again of whether we should do this or not once the safety has been addressed?
So I think, we work a lot on the safety part, and the tools that we're using will get safer and safer. There is no doubt about that. I think the main issue we are of germline editing is the risk that of eugenics. That's what we're talking about at the Gattaca. You said I'm enthusiastic. I love Gattaca, but it's show the risk we could have, and this is a very powerful tool. And for example, in this case of this Chinese researcher who did this germline editing in the embryos, apparently he didn't get the approval. He did that, in his lab. He modified the CCR5 gene, supposedly because, so the father of these children had HIV. CCR5, if you modify it, should prevent you to contract HIV. So that was the reasoning. But first of all, you don't contract HIV if it's your dad, or only if the mom would be carrying HIV. So that was not the right reason. But there is also something even behind that. There were studies showing that mutation in CCR5 can make you smarter. So now we are like, are we really modifying for preventing a disease, or are we trying to enhance some traits? And that's my fear. I love gene therapy. As I said, it's my passion. I really believe that many disorders that are as the origin of a gene cannot be treated with drugs because the defects are so profound that a drug will never be able to compensate for all the defects. And we've seen so many success now with gene therapy, where the kids were dying, and now they can live, they can walk, they can have a much better life. So I really believe in gene therapy. But I think that there is a limit we should not pass. And it's my personal opinion that germline gene editing could be that line. Because after, what do we define as a disease, or how do we define enhancement? And we take the risk then to create superior people. And where are we going there? What will be the stop of that? There will be always someone saying, oh, that's a good reason to change that gene because maybe I'm too small and I cannot live, better. But so I don't know. I think we should have some restriction, and that for me it would be the one. But again, there are other opinions on that, and we will be also very interested to know what you guys think, because I have a lot of students, and some are very in favor of it. So.
So, in regards to like the AI part of things, one thing that I do a lot in my work is I talk to many startups, companies, some coming out of like Jennifer Doudna's lab, who are trying to address the technical issue, right? So I agree that there probably could be a time in which we'll reach this point in which there are no off-target consequences, which we don't have a great handle of, from my understanding. In terms of like using AI, I know people are trying to do directed evolution of certain kinds of gene editing and gene therapy tools to make sure that there are minimal off-target effects. So I definitely think that separating the technical aspect is of great importance. We don't want any unintended consequences. I think the emergent issue here is that of what happens to the human race and human identity. And I think that is maybe a conversation that is a bit not like over my head, but it's going to take a lot of care, and maybe someone like Reuven who's very invested in it, because like I think it's very dependent on certain definitions, and it's going to be a bit challenging to come up with what is okay. Is it preventing disease, which was kind of the case of Cherqui, which some people argue that it was unnecessary because the patients weren't necessarily, well, they weren't even patients yet, would get the disease. Is it to cure someone whose life would be ending very early? Is that okay? And then, of course, yeah, there's I want blue eyes, I want to be smarter, I want to be taller and more handsome or whatever. So I think there's different categories that we'll probably see get laid out there, but
yeah, so I guess maybe one of my roles as a philosopher on this panel is to make things more complicated. I just want to maybe expand on 2 points I think were made quite well. So one about the distinction between enhancement and treatment, which is often a line that's drawn between acceptable and unacceptable use of these kinds of technologies, and why that's difficult. And also why the distinction between germline modification and somatic cell modification and justice might be more complicated than initially seems. I'll try and be brief, but I just want to explain why that's a little bit complicated. I think many people, when I ask students where they think we ought to draw the line, everybody's really gung-ho on preventing disease, and everybody's really, really nervous about enhancement because of the Gattaca kind of concerns. I have students, I have thought people have forgotten Gattaca. I mean, students seem to have forgotten the Matrix, but Gattaca seems to hold their mind, which is great. But how do we distinguish enhancement from treatment? That's hard. So I'll give you an example. If I can create some genetic modification that would make individuals incapable of contracting pneumonia, right? I'm not treating a disease. I don't have a disease. I am changing somebody's biology such that they can no longer get a disease. That seems to be like an enhancement. I'm giving somebody an ability they didn't have before. Is that acceptable or unacceptable? Is that an enhancement or a treatment? Is that a kind of use of this technology that we would allow or we wouldn't allow? And so there's lots of these kind of gray zone cases that I think make that line between treatment and enhancement really fuzzy. The second point I just want to build on quickly is the question about justice and germline genetic modification versus somatic cell line modification. One reason people give for why we should worry about germline modification is this Gattaca-type future. You have this set of the haves and the set of the have-nots. Some philosophers argue, though, that problem might equally arise even if we restricted ourselves to somatic germline therapy, and it might even be made worse if we do that. Why? Because if you need to get the treatment, right, because it's not sort of baked into the germline, you then will have to go and pay for it, right? And that'll be really expensive. You might have people economically excluded from getting this kind of treatment, and yet you still have one group of people that can always get this kind of treatment because they can afford it, and this group of the have-nots who can't. Whereas if you just pushed this more desirable modification to the population, you might think eventually everybody will have this trait, and that might be more just in the long run. And so here's a debate amongst philosophers about whether or not concerns about justice actually suggest that we should favor one over the other. So just to make things harder for us, I'm not going to answer the question. Yeah.
So in preparing for this, I did try to come up with as many hairballs as I could for Reuven and Professor Cherqui, Stephanie, which is that what do you think about the children in the UK who are being born to three parents, which have, you know, a mitochondria from a third person who is absolutely becoming a germline augmented individual? You know, maybe it's not traditional in the sense of like changing the DNA structure inherent.
Maybe you can explain a little bit more what happened. So because maybe not
Yeah.
everybody is aware of
So
that.
in last year or so,
Yeah, just a little bit more about that.
yeah, there were several. There was an announcement that a child had been born to three parents, and what exactly did that mean? There was a couple that was having trouble having a child, and it had to do with, I believe, if I got this right.
Mitochondrial protein. They have a disease just touching the genes in the mitochondria. So it was a pure mitochondrial DNA issue.
Right. So they went ahead and found someone with I guess you could say, a corrective or a mitochondria that would be able to replace the genes that were defective in the germ cells of the people who wanted to have a child, and they were able to have this child who's now healthy. And when I was reading about it, there are now not many, but there are several of these children who have been born. They haven't released how many. So, I mean, I almost feel like that throws everything on its head in some ways, because those, I mean, yeah, those are going to be transmitted to future generations in certain cases, at least the maternal way, because that's how mitochondria are transmitted. And we have no idea about what those consequences are. So, and people needing to have a child, I mean, I don't want to say that's as debatable as it gets, but I mean, sure, we need to propagate as human species, but if you can't have children because of a mitochondrial issue, should you be having children? You know, these things get a little emotional and hard.
That's where, you know, this gets emotional also for the students. It's like, you know, if you get there, you know, some people really want. I mean, there was this article on Bespoke on these two parents who had cystic fibrosis. So they were both carrying the disease, and they really wanted to have a children on their own. So they wanted to get germline modification. So it's not allowed. So they couldn't. But there is this big debate. But what you are explaining about replacing the mitochondria, it's still a genetic modification, but it's not in the main genome. So we can maybe debate that it might not drive the traits of the people, and it's kind of an organelle that you give. So that's why this one are allowed. But, you know, is that very different or not? I don't know. Actually, you know, the only time, you know, again, I was with my student, and there was this, someone brought up is say, let's say, you know, I realized that my husband and we are like ApoE4 positive. So I don't know, ApoE4 is, if you are carrying ApoE4, you have higher chance of having developing Alzheimer. If you are homozygote, I mean, the chance is really off the roof, you know. So then it's the first time I was like, wait a second, you know, would I then want to do it? You know, so whereas I'm you know, very against, so, you know, because what you said really scared me, like, because this is what, you know, like we should, you know, or change all these, you know, mutation and all, you know, we are all the same, you know, that's what we don't want. But, you know, after, you know, it's also good to look at both sides and say, wait a second, what if it would be me? What if I would have CF and I want my own child? So, you know, that's why I think there's not a right or wrong answer. And, you know, and I would be curious maybe to know if someone would like to comment. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Daniel, a freshman student in UCSD major in neurobiology, and I'm currently taking a genetic class. So I'm kind of like a question just to draw like the CRISPR, like designed gene. Like we say in the crossing over or the translation or the transcription process, there are many kind of like opportunities to having some like change on gene, like inversion, like deletion, like all of this kind of stuff. So if there's a baby who's naturally deleted as CCR5, which may have the same effect as the Chinese scientists modified the infant, but like why we are making that kind of baby acceptable, but we are making the technology made baby like unacceptable, even though they probably have the exactly same genetic sequence. Like that is ethical question I probably want to question now.
I could try to answer that question. Yeah. So I think the question you raise is a really good one, and part of what makes the question about germline modification and what is permissible, what is not permissible, very difficult, is the genome is itself dynamic, right? There are de novo mutations, also the processes that lead to that, and that's some of that, or a lot of it, isn't accidental. That's what we need. It's built into biology for species to develop new traits. That's just part of how biology works. So why is it different if an individual does intentionally what nature might otherwise do? And this question comes up in the case of GMO crops, for example, right? So for a long time, people were trying to change the traits of crops by doing things like exposing them to radiation, generating random mutations, seeing which ones were good, keeping the ones that were good, and nobody had any real objection to that. Then when suddenly somebody wants to make a very specific change using a very specific tool that they have really good reason to believe will do something good, there's panic, right? So why? Why treat these differently? I think one reason why people try and treat these differently has to do with concerns about human beings like us who don't have full understanding of the way biological systems work, trying to maybe get our hands into a domain where we actually lack sufficient knowledge to predict its outcomes. And there's this view that, well, maybe sort of natural processes have some, I don't know, caked in wisdom, for lack of a better term, that we lack. And I think that's where a lot of people's concern lies with the artificial versus natural mutation kind of question. I don't think that that's necessarily that convincing, but I do think that's sort of the genesis, right? That's not to say that I think that we should run wild, do whatever we like, but I think that's not going to be the correct reason. Though I think that if you push people on it, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say things like, oh, well, we shouldn't be playing God, right? If nature wants to develop some kind of change, leave that to nature. We should keep our hands out of it. But I think that doesn't fly. I mean, in a certain sense, we make modifications to biological systems, human bodies, all the time, and that might interfere with, what nature, quote unquote, might have intended, and we don't see that as problematic. So I think whatever the reason is, it's going to have to be something different. But that's probably the most common reason that people would give.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's, are we directing the evolution ourselves? Is it happening anyways? Not to make this more complicated, but the other example that was given besides Gattaca was Jurassic Park, right? How many people are familiar with the company Colossal Bio? A few. So for those of you who aren't familiar, this is the direwolf resurrection story that maybe many of you have seen, which in my opinion is complete garbage. But in that sense, maybe in what is important, what is ethical, what is not, I think there is this human-centric approach to a lot of these things. Maybe we need to be working with wolves or something like that, and other creatures to get our handle on it. I mean, it's a very messy situation. Whether you think playing God, quote unquote, is like a human right, or like I think at some point it becomes more of an emotional argument than it does necessarily a truly what is right. I mean, now we're talking about like the ethics, the nature of morality and whatnot, and whether there are ethics built into the nature of the universe and stuff like that. But I don't want to get overly complicated, but there are people who are trying to essentially bring back species, they claim. So like, what does that do to our entire world, let alone trying to create new humans who may not have existed in nature, or who may exist, just we're speeding it up in some ways.
And we have a question in the back.
Yep. And just to follow up, I mean, there is something even more scary, I think, for me now is like, now it's very common to just clone your pet. I mean, I was on last week, I just met at the dinner someone who said, oh, I cloned my cat, and it's just normal. And I was like, whoa, this is, I mean, already that's, we're playing with God, from my point of view.
Right. So it took about 4 billion years to lead to what we are today. And the reason why gene therapy right now is addressing mostly, rare diseases is because as an entity, we do pretty good in general. And sometimes you have an individual that is missing a gene for a very important protein. You provide the ability to express the gene and you cure, right? That's where we stand in gene therapy so far. As far as enhancing our genome, I don't think it should be a concern. I think you should probably just think about what can we do to make, cure diseases. That is already complex enough. Enhancing the human being, if I really want a beautiful kid, I don't need gene therapy. I can just mate with a beautiful girl, okay? That is the evolution that we have experienced so far. So I think gene therapy should not be used, try to enhance the human being, because I think the risk of screwing up the entire human race is bigger than any enhancement you could possibly achieve. That's my point of view.
Hi, my name is Serbi. I'm a molecular cell biology student at UCSD. And kind of building off what we were talking about, my question is, how do bioethicists kind of play into this? Because as we were talking about, like, certain couples, like, if you aren't able to have kids, is that like the sign of like you shouldn't be able to like carry on your line? And then like alongside with like gene editing and gene therapy, or is that like a matter of disturbing the balance? Like if we start making modifications, is that of like what nature quote unquote intended? Does that just mean that humans will come up with other ways to like introduce other problems as a result of that interference?
Great. I think that's an excellent question. Actually, I think we emailed before we were talking about this kind of problem before today's panel, and this might be maybe a partial reply to the gentleman. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, who spoke just a second ago. Yeah, so what I think a problem you run into quickly when we say, well, we should just let nature run its course and we have allow the wisdom of nature. One challenge to that is, I think you're quite right to point out, what does that mean for our attitudes towards a fertility treatment, right? Because you might have someone say, okay, well, the fact that these two particular people are not successful at having a child that's genetically related to them is natural process saying that this combination of genes is something that shouldn't happen, right? And maybe we don't understand why that is, but that's what's happening, and maybe we shouldn't try and force the issue through, IVF or something like that. But yet we do tend to think that fertility treatment is acceptable. Is that fighting against nature, right? Are we now trying to introduce combinations of genes that nature doesn't want? Or are we reading too much into this, right? Are we treating a disease through this, right? Infertility as a disease. And I don't think that there is, I think that's a difficult question and one that's debated. I will say that in the world of philosophy, there's a divided opinion. And there are individuals who think that actually we place too much importance on genetic connection to our offspring. Though becoming a parent, for those who want to be, can be very enriching and valuable, I've found it very enriching and valuable, but that we shouldn't confuse the value that comes from raising children with the value that comes from sort of passing on genes or raising children that are genetically related to us. And those would argue that it's actually a misuse of resources to try and allow people to create children with their own genes when we could, in fact, allow those or provide ways for those people to become parents through other means, right? By donor gametes or adoption or things like that. Though, of course, there's others who disagree and say infertility is a disease. these fertility treatments aren't some kind of enhancement or interfering with nature. It's in fact treating a disease. But I think this is another situation where that distinction between what is and isn't treatment and enhancement gets difficult and gray very quickly. Yeah.
As I'm sitting here, the gentleman's comment in the back is kind of stuck with me in the sense that, like, or I'm going to combine a couple things here. There is the playing God issue, right, which in my opinion is a misnomer and misassociation between like a cloud daddy, Abrahamic God, and God, which, without getting too philosophical, is that just everything, whatnot. But my point is, we are far beyond the point of influencing the world around us. Like, I mean, whatever we had for lunch, the process of making it is probably causing mutations way beyond, just ourselves and whatnot. So in some ways, like, this is almost just like an emotional semantic issue. If we really want to take it into account, like not affecting mutations and being like sterile in that regard, like we are way past that line. So in some ways it is like this, I don't know, argument that is purely, it's not even really rational. It's purely emotional, I think.
So I think that for me, there is a big distinction between being sterile and helping, to couples to have children and to play with genes. I agree with you that, we don't know when you act on a germline, the benefits you can have, maybe, but also what you could create. And down the line, what we will get. So I think that for me, it's a big distinction. But I think we have to really, and that's why, I'm very strongly supportive of the gene therapy for children who are already like born with a disease, who have a poor quality of life, who are suffering, and that if you don't help them, they can last for years. I mean, one of the diseases I'm working on is Friedreich ataxia. I mean, they, the children is normal and finally lose balance, and they little by little lose their ability to walk, and they will stay like on a wheelchair for 20 years until they die without moving. So that's something, we want to fight against. That's for me what is gene therapy about. And that's why for me, this is the line we should draw. When there are children who are dying or and already born with a disease. When we go to the germline, as you said, we don't know what we are going to do. And we don't know the risk of, again, announcements. And there are a lot of debate of for and, against. But then I think we are creating an issue of something that can be beautiful. That's my,
Yeah, so I want to just build on that and maybe offer. We've talked a bit about the playing God objection to creating specific kind of traits. What I want to do is maybe just briefly offer you a different argument that I think sort of captures what you think is the good bits about genetic therapy, but also might help us avoid the Gattaca kind of world. And that's an argument put forward by Michael Sandel and to a certain extent Habermas. So I won't get into the minutiae of the differences. And the view here is that one of the bad things that happens if we were to engage in this process of trying to actually fine-grain select the traits of our children in this very narrow way is that it would change the way we as a society view children and view ourselves. We'd stop seeing ourselves as part of the world and part of nature, but as products, right? And that's going to be a fundamental shift in the way we relate to each other and our children, and that will be bad. And that happens when we think, oh, I want my child to have, be 6'5" or 6'8" and have, be super intelligent and all, if I'm trying to, do this sort of checklist approach to my child, then I'm no longer, as Michael Sandel says, open to the unbidden, open to just, the gift of life and just sort of working with what you get. And of course, on that kind of model, we can draw a distinction between selecting very specific traits and trying to engineer children to have a very particular kind of life, and trying to prevent disease. Because if you're preventing disease, you're not engaged in this project of fine-grained selection of personality, intelligence, and traits. And so on this kind of model, we could see why.
How do you define a disease?
That will.
As your colleague said,
Yeah.
it's a
a slippery slope. It is. So
You know, I mean, it's like for some people, what they define a disease is not a real disease for others. So this is where we have to be really careful.
yeah. So I think underlying this
So
whole
rather,
whole. Oh, I can stop. Yeah.
no, no. You wanted to have a comment on that?
Mm.
Did somebody else have a question? Okay. Hi, my name is Becky. I'm a postdoc in pediatrics. I have hopefully a question that kind of leverages exactly what you said and expands on it. So I'd love to hear your ethics and consideration just of the somatic cell gene therapies when we start to think about moving from rare diseases, which is where we're expanding rapidly, into diseases that we see affecting a wide majority of the population, such as cardiovascular diseases, which we're now starting to see some therapies coming out for treating cardiovascular disease. So thinking about the ethics now of a lot of people potentially not having access to a disease that's affecting a majority of the populations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. I think I really believe in gene therapy for the future of medicine, but I put a but. I don't want this to become like easy access, gene therapy. Because sometimes I heard, when I go to the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, you see everything. And some people were starting to think about, using gene therapy for arthritis or using gene therapy for this, or, they will use put viral vector in your body for, and is it okay or is it not? There are still a lot of risk associated with gene therapy. And I think that what you are saying is a very good point. I truly believe in gene therapy, but I still also believe that we should use it when there is nothing else to do, because it's still playing with genes. It's still a treatment that you will give to a person that you cannot get back. So if you do something harmful, it's really bad. So I would not be in favor of using gene therapy for more common diseases when there is something else that can be done. That would be, again, my personal opinion.
So, I mean, one thing I guess I want to separate is there's like this notion of it's not equitable healthcare, right? I think the idea that we actually care about equity in the whole world is kind of bullshit. I mean, and so that's just my personal opinion. I think what maybe is important here is that, like, what is the medical ethics of gene therapy and gene editing? And I was talking to someone about this, CEO of a company who's like, our code is do no harm, right? And is there a better, simpler, safer option already? And I think that that is a pretty important way of looking at things. But the idea that, well, this person shouldn't get it because this person can get it, or vice versa, is, I don't know. I think it's a lot. I mean, I think we're way beyond actually caring about these things. And so if you can help somebody, I say that's a good thing. But it is complicated, of course.
Yeah, so I think at the intro talk, we mentioned Glybera, right? Which I like as a great example. It was developed at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I'm from Vancouver Island, so just across the pond from where I'm from. And the reason why that drug or the treatment is no longer available is because it was priced out of the market. I think it was about $1 million a dose, and it became unaffordable. And of course, the scientists who were involved in making this, they said we had nothing to do with the pricing. That somebody buys a patent and they can do what they like with it. And of course, I think newer treatments probably aren't quite that expensive, or I don't know, the economy's changed such that it becomes worthwhile for insurers to cover it. I'm not sure about the economics of healthcare. But I mean, maybe pushing back a little bit, I do think access is an important ethical question. I do think even if we think about whether people should be helped or not others, or things like that. Because again, I am worried about kind of the Gattaca type scenario, even with disease. If you had a group of people all who just never suffer heart disease, right, because their parents can all provide them with this treatment, and expand that across a variety of different diseases, you will eventually end up with these sort of two distinct kind of subpopulations that have vastly different qualities of life, and there are serious justice issues we should think about there. I guess where my angle on that is I think that should cause us to think carefully about the way we look at intellectual property and ownership of treatment, especially treatment that's produced using lots of public funds, right? And I think given the amount of public money that goes into these cutting edge scientific developments, I think that should give us pause to reconsider the way we use our patent system, and maybe use those kinds of tools to make these kinds of treatments more accessible, especially because it's people's tax dollars that are funding large amounts of the basic research that this relies on. I think there's one other question. Yeah.
As you pass the microphone, though, I wanted to come back to something that she said, which is, and I think, I'm being very devil's advocating over here, but it's like, I think the question was like, what roles do bioethicists have? And yeah. What roles do bioethicists have in I don't know, in companies forming, at the FDA, at stuff like that? Do you think that we're not addressing those sorts of things? I think there's potentially something.
Yeah, so bioethicist is a very large umbrella, and there are lots of people in the world of bioethics that have different kinds of roles. Uh, you might have a clinical ethicist at a hospital that helps sort of specific patients navigate complicated ethical questions. Classic one, I guess, in the case of reproduction is you have a young, a minor who's going through cancer treatment that might impact their fertility. Should you save their, gametes for future use? Is this okay? Is it not okay? You have people in companies that try and make sure that companies follow their ethical guidelines. You get sort of more academic kind of bioethicists like me, which try and sort of get to the root of what actually is the right thing to do. So your question is, are we addressing these kind of questions correctly about whether the value of biological offspring, or and I'm curious
Well,
at what level?
I want to add, because just this meeting that happened here in March, right? My question was, who was there on the ethics side, right? There's the scientists, there's the clinicians, but similar to John's question, I think was, was there a bioethicist there, and from what angle were they coming from?
Yeah.
So Jonathan kind of hit my question as well, but.
I mean, I guess from.
Can we ask the question first?
Yes.
Oh, it's okay. Okay, well, all I was going to say is just going back, and I do want to hear that point, though. Going back to, like, what is a disease? I think it's very interesting, like, philosophically, to think about, like, the values we hold as a society right now. And my question is, like, if you think about blindness, the gene therapy for blindness is celebrated, right? It's more or less, like, it's viewed positively. But then in my family, like, we have dwarfism, for example, right? And then you take gene therapy for dwarfism, and there's actually a lot of, like, backlash from that community and not in favor of it. So it's very interesting, and I want to get your perspectives on that, right? Of, it feels like one is an identity, but they're both, changing a person's health in some way. But I think it's just the values we hold as a society right now. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
So actually, this is exactly where we have that topic, because this is a very good topic. Again, what is a disease? That was, I was saying that before. For some people, something will be considered as a disease. Some people will be not. And for example, if you propose to parents who are deaf to have a children, who is not, and to treat them with gene therapy, a lot of them will be very against it, because they don't consider themselves, having a disease. They are part of the community that they love, and they, they consider themselves with a normal life, and they want their children to be the same. The Down syndrome, there are many people saying that, they bring so much to our society. And now we are trying to find treatment for Down syndrome. A lot of people also are against that. So it's exactly what you are saying. And that's why, there is the line between what is disease and what is not. It's very hard to define it. And that's why, for me, it's like, that's why we shouldn't play with embryo before they are born, because, we don't know. First of all, how they will be and how they will consider if they have a disease or not. But when you have a children who is dying, who cannot move, who cannot feed, who cannot talk, then yes, and that is clearly suffering. For me, that's define a disease. So, I think everybody should have a choice. And that's very important. And that's why somatic gene therapy, for me, it's acceptable, but not the other one.
There's another question.
But you want to maybe to answer.
Hi, going back to the question of accessibility of gene therapy, I wanted to ask, do you see any way of scaling gene therapies more? Because essentially gene therapy is at its core very personalized, as in you make a therapy for each person that comes with the disease. And I've seen stuff like there's this therapy called CAR NK cell therapy. For initially, there was this treatment called CAR T cell therapy for certain types of cancers. But then scientists developed another one called CAR NK cell, and that they said was more scalable because NK cells are part of the innate immune response, so you can give it to other people as well. You don't need to specifically design it to a single person's needs. So do you see any future in like making off-the-shelf gene therapies which are more applicable to everyone, so that creates accessibility as well as lowers costs like dramatically?
So I think there's a lot of people working on this issue. It's very interesting and exciting, and I think some of the greatest innovation happens on this level. I mean, we're running into funding issues with people being able to advance CRISPR therapies, and I've spoken to people at the Innovative Genomics Institute, which is Jennifer Doudna's institute at Berkeley, and they're trying to figure out how to best address this by kind of basketing certain indications. I think that there's a few technical ways of getting at this. One is like a pseudo, with gene therapy as we know it, as like replacing a gene's function, or one that's bad with one that's good, you arguably can cover many, many mutations, right? By putting in a functional full-length one. In theory, I don't know how expensive that is across the board. Then there are people who are, I just spoke to a company called Alterna this week for my podcast, and they have come up with I guess you'd call it a gene therapy, in which they have created a tRNA. If you guys remember in your basic biology, that's it's responsible for translating the mRNA codons, the triplets, into amino acids. And there are certain diseases where nonsense mutations only come up like incredibly rarely and cause a disease. And their theory is, if we can address all nonsense mutations across every single disease, like we have one pretty cheap therapy that can change millions and millions and millions of lives. So, I think it is very important to be able to provide this in a accessible way, and I think that there are people really thinking about it. In some cases, it may require a little bit more precision, if you will, but yeah.
So you are really hitting a very important point. The issue of gene therapy is that it's custom made, for many of them, especially the cell gene therapy that I'm doing. It's like we take the stem cells from the patient, we have to gene modify them ex vivo. All this to create are very, even, to go from the bench to bedside, it's very costly. It's like, because it's not like a drug. When we give it, it's done, so we can really harm people. So what the FDA require is really, extensive and challenging. and very costly. So it takes years and millions of dollars to develop. So we were talking about the cost. Yes, it costs a lot because of this reason. But I will be the advocate of the cost. Maybe, when you have a dose of gene therapy that, to make, even to create, it costs millions of dollars to even, not, but hundreds of thousands of dollars to make, like your treatment. So it's not like a drug, first of all. But let's say it's $1 million a dose, but it would be a one-time treatment. Most of the genetic disorder are chronic disorder with many, issues, with many hospital stay, and it costs a lot of money. And for example, a concrete example, a patient with cystinosis that we are treating, in our clinical trial, there is a drug that exists called cysteamine that can prolong their life until adulthood. They still have a lot of issues. They still need transplantation. They go to hospital many times. But the drug itself costs $500,000 per patient per year. Plus they drop $50,000 per year. So put together, the gene therapy is much less. And for many disorders like sickle cell disease or, it's like very expensive. So yes, each drug, like a drug product, a gene therapy product cost a lot. But first of all, they cost a lot to generate, to show the safety. It costs a lot to create for each patient. And most of the time, it's a one-time treatment that will really stop the whole hospital stay and everything. So at the end, it will be less for the society. So I don't, I don't say that it's great, but the price should be reduced. And on that front, the FDA really helped work with the investigator to create platform. Platform meaning that to try to not get all these safety studies for everything, every product, so the cost to make them will be decreased, and so the cost for the patient will be less. So we are getting towards a less expensive drug product for each patient. But, there is also a reason why it's so expensive also. So there is a question
I'm Ariana. I'm a bioengineering grad student, and you just touched on the regulatory aspect as well. And I think usually it's the case with new emerging technologies, only the regulatory framework is really formed when people realize how much power they have, right? I think the EU just recently really agreed on a framework on how to treat AI applications, right? And currently, as of my knowledge, please correct me if I'm wrong, all the regulation of gene therapy is still governed by the FDA in the States. And I would be curious to understand what's your thought on regulation of gene therapy in the future, also from a global perspective. I don't know, should there be maybe a like committee nationally, globally that gives the rules? If so, who should be part of it? Maybe broadly speaking, where do you see the regulatory aspect of gene therapy going?
So gene therapy is still a young drug, and the FDA is still learning. And plus, it evolves every time. We were going to using viral vector, then now we went, so like AAV, or lentivirus vector. And after we went to the gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9. Now we are going to the base editing, the prime editing. So the FDA has trouble to even catch up with that and make sure that to know what safety study they have to require from you. I just got a pre-IND, with FDA for, the predicate axia with gene editing. They were asking things that didn't make sense, and they were like basing on using lentivirus vector. I said that you cannot do that for the gene editing. So they are still learning, because it's a therapy that is it's a moving platform that keep changing. So it's very difficult for the FDA to keep up. So they are not, to answer your question, they are not, there are like some major rule, but they are not a rule that can define all the gene therapy treatment and drugs. They have to really learn for each of them and try to figure out the best way to find the safety. So it's not an easy task you are, asking. Even though we would love to have, like standard rules, and it's just not possible because it's changing every year and it's evolving so fast that the FDA have also trouble to figure out the safety part of it.
Can I say something very quick? Very often the FDA looks like a police, right? But they really are not. The FDA has developed, in collaboration with the industry, the small molecule drug regulation, cell therapy, and then gene therapy. They are trying to define what are the quality standards. For any company that actually implements things that can have an impact on the human body, there has to be a very high level of quality assurance, quality control program. And the FDA wants to work with the industry and the pioneer in this field to define these characteristics. It's not going to go away. You need quality control, you need quality assurance, and you need to have regulations. And I'm glad that they are there to regulate it, because some companies are good, some companies are not so good.
Yeah, so there's, I don't know how many of you know Peter Marks, who recently stepped down from the FDA, and he was the head of CBER, which was the Center for Biologics and Cell Engineering Research, which is where a lot of this was being regulated. And the FDA was doing an amazing job, had several programs, one called Sparks, where people who were actively trying to develop drugs and getting into the clinical trials for the first time with gene therapies and cell therapies were working hand in hand with the FDA to develop, as Stephanie said, the endpoints that we need. So I think those kinds of guardrails are really good, and we are learning on the fly, and it's a very interesting conversation. As it goes back to like the international part of this, I'm going to try to like tie everything together that we've talked about in some ways, which is what is okay to do. What is ethically okay? Is it a medically ethical? Does it make someone's life better? Is it economically better? Does it make things cheaper? Does it cause more harm to society than it does good? So how many people know about like the pig xenotransplantation work being going on, right? So there's these new pigs where they have, I forget how many edits, to be able to generate human-like hearts and livers and kidneys. And for those to replace failing hearts, failing livers, which cost our society a ton of money, and keeping people alive on dialysis and things like that are far, far more expensive than having someone get a pig heart and potentially them get fixed. So, then the next thing is, are we okay with having half pig people? And is France okay with it if I go and travel there? And, have I gone under all the checks, virus-wise to make sure that I am okay? Can this person then marry someone from my country and have children? Of course, this is not this is not a germline issue, but, there are obviously people are going to be moving around in this world who get gene editing. There was a woman, the first person who got the sickle cell treatment, Victoria Gray. She was from the South, could never travel. She could never be on an airplane because she couldn't have the sufficient oxygen levels because of her disease. And she went, after she got her treatment, took a plane to London to go to a conference and to talk about her experience. And that was something that she would never go to experience before. So, that's obviously a very beautiful thing. But again, just like bringing in this next level of what is okay, what is good, who's involved in this discussion, it is very, very, very complicated, of course.
Yeah. I agree it's complicated. One thing I always worry about is unfounded fear amongst the public of people who might have a xenotransplant, right? So you mentioned this worry about maybe you have some viruses and that might be a danger to other. But of course people travel around the world all the time and might have encountered viruses that might pose some kind of danger to others. And we unless we have a very strong particular reason to think that we should be concerned, we generally tend not to be. I guess I would caution against I think some worries are well-founded and some less founded, and I think we have to be careful about people being afraid of things because they're new, which happens. Yeah.
So I mean, I agree with that. I think that in this case, like there's the going back to the do no harm, right? What are we supposed to do in medicine? What are we supposed to do to help people? I think that the issue with xenotransplantation is that we're creating a new type of virus that could not previously infect people. Whereas, travel is like, that's just going back to this, is creating radioactive things as dangerous as doing gene therapy. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the risk is much more minimal. I mean, because in pigs there are some virus that could potentially infect human, and I think that's what you are referring to. But I'm sure that these pigs will be very like screened, and So I mean, I see that as another issue. I would be. I'm waiting for this to work. I mean, I would be very in favor.
Oh yeah, I'm not.
Is there other question or comment? All right, so maybe we can go to the next topic.
Hi, I'm Presley. I'm a recently graduated ecology, behavior, and evolution major, and I'm just wondering I mean, we're all debating about what the right thing to do is, and but even if each of us comes to an agreement, like in this room, that wouldn't really matter much outside this room, right? So, like, I guess whose decisions on what's right and wrong like ends up mattering in the end for what happens? Is it going to be like, oh, public opinion, we're going to put a lot of this stuff up to a vote, or is it going to be more like the scientists in charge who are doing the discovering and the research? It's like if any of them quit, then it's like, okay, we have to give up and start over. Or is it going to be a panel of bioethicists? Is every single company or industry who's doing any sort of gene editing, are they going to have to hire like a group of bioethicists? What's going to stop them from just like hiring a group of 10 people who agrees with them? Is it going to be like a legal issue or like a private issue? I mean, the answer is probably different depending on the country, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around that concept.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're totally right. So there are rules, I mean, as of today, germline modification is forbidden by FDA, by, some, committees. So we are regulated. But, for example, this Chinese researcher supposedly didn't do it without anyone knowing. That's not even sure. He went to prison because of what he did, for, Germany. But he's already out of prison and he's already, back in a lab. So, I don't know, what to think about it. But so we are not making the rules. The FDA making rules. But now, you were talking about Peter Marks, who for me was a really amazing man, head of a FDA, really smart, trying to do the right thing. But now, he quit and saying that he's, couldn't stand the lie and things. So who will be next? Who will decide at the FDA what is right or wrong? So that can be completely changing. So then, you're right. I mean, it's like a few people will decide. So it's not us, I mean, we can just give opinion. But at the end of the day, there are people way above that will make the rules. And we are dependent of these people. And we can just hope that they will be good to make a decision.
So I think who we should listen to, clearly the philosophers. No, I'm joking. I kid. No, so I think really, I think what the core of your question is what do we do when we have a sort of democratic society, right? And we think democracy is important, and we should create rules and guidelines following democratic processes. Also, being fully aware that democracy, democratic processes, I know it's going to be news for everybody, can get things wrong, right? You can, for a random example, you might find somebody in charge of a health department who thinks that vaccines are terrible, right? This can happen. So I guess the way I like to try and look at this kind of question of who ought to make the rules and what should we do is to cleave these two things apart, right? There's what is the moral answer, and I happen to be a moral realist. I think that there are morally right and wrong answers to these questions. I'm not going to try and defend moral realism here for you. It would take all day. But then I also think, though, that political legitimacy is very important, right? And democratic institutions are very important. And sometimes that means that we're going to end up in a situation where governments and regulators who, following democratic processes, end up getting things wrong and making the wrong decisions. And then what's the correct response to that? I think that is to try and push back and to argue for why they're wrong, get politically involved, and try and do what you can to have a say in the regulations that you think are problematic and push. And I give you an example of this. So you talked about mitochondrial donation earlier on. I think it's a great topic because it's actually the first thing I worked on after my PhD was regulation for mitochondrial donation in the UK. And the way they try and tackle this problem is this extensive process of public consultation where they will announce, like, this is a proposal. We want to know whether we should allow this treatment. And then try and hear back from the public and try and figure out what concerns the public has about the technology. And then the system tries to sort out, first of all, what concerns are valid and what are invalid, which of course is a value-laden process itself, and then try and figure out rules that capture what people find concerning or what issues they might see with the new technology. So in the case of mitochondrial donation, for example, it's a question of how do you think about mitochondrial donors, right? Are they like spermanova donors? Should you have some right to know about who your mitochondrial donor is? Because in the UK, if you are conceived via donor gametes, at a certain point, you're allowed to find out who your gamete donor is. Should this apply to mitochondrial donation too? And this is a question that they kind of put to the public to try and see what the reasons are one way or the other. The UK decided actually you shouldn't for reasons I can get into if people are curious. But I think that we should separate the political question from the moral question. And like in all cases where we think that the political answer diverges from the moral question, you have to try and work through the mechanisms at play if you're in a functioning democracy to try and get the democratically enacted rules to align more with what morality demands of us.
Yeah, so I mean, I keep saying this thing, it's complicated, right? Yeah. I think that it is really important for us to distinguish, and you have someone like Stephanie, right, who's very obviously, in my opinion, she's so into the medical way of thinking about this, which is incredible and very good, and I think that's a lot of where this discussion should be contained, right? Okay, should we do somatic versus germline, right? What is in with our control? What can do the least amount of harm? Things of that nature. Then when we start talking about what is best for all of humanity is kind of that it's not only a gray area, but then you start talking about who should be the holders of truth and how should society be run, and should we have a democratic society? I don't know. There's a lot of stupid people out there. Is it actually to the benefit of all of us? If the stupidest person is about average, that means that 50% of the population is even stupider than that. So I don't know what is okay, what is not. I mean, I think this is a separate conversation in my opinion, and I think that going back to kind of the part of, I think what Reuven is getting at and Stephanie this whole time is that there's a role that technology and medicine can play here to bring potentially good outcomes to people. How can we best do that? In some cases, it's what is the safest cases, which is somatic mutations. It's even with technologies like epigenetic editing, which we haven't talked about, which allows for the reversal of certain changes that are made. But yeah, if you try to solve everything at one time, I don't know if that's a possible task.
issues and things like that. I think that there's also the opportunities. I think we were talking about how the technology is changing so quickly, and what are some things to be optimistic about and look at. So with that, does the audience have a favorite topic up here that seems really interesting that they want to hear about? Looks like
I wanted to ask, is there any utility which you see that AI can provide in gene therapy and probably helping to, and how do you think it can help in bettering it now that we're like in the age of?
So I'm scared of AI, but I see a lot of benefits, and in gene therapy, AI could play a very a big role. As we said, gene therapy is custom made for some, especially for cell gene therapy. For example, for curing cancer with CAR-T, which really revolutionized the gene therapy. For people who couldn't be treated for cancer, they was dying. Now with a CAR-T, we can really cure them. The issue with that therapy is that, so it's costly to make because we take the T cells from the people to make them to kill their own B cells. So we're engineering them. Only 20%, I mean, for some company, only 20% of the cells that we make are good enough to be used. So you imagine the waste of manufacturing here, the waste of money. And how can we do that better? And there are some people already working with AI to try to figure out what are the limits, what are the weaknesses, how we can do better. And they have some success. So I'm sure that one of the resolution in gene therapy will be AI, actually. So I will have to also work with AI.
Could I add something to that? Sorry.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I wanted to ask, like, in what area do you see AI affecting it? Like, do you see it in designing the therapy, for example, like, and possibly looking at the off-target effects it could cause?
Totally. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, for the off-target effect, I mean, we are working on that with a company because that's for the freak ataxia, the gene editing. This is the main concern from the FDA is that they want to show us that they want to show that we don't have any off-target effect. We work with a great company, Secure, and they are really doing a great job. It takes a long time. It's time consuming, but they are really going throughout and show us the safety of our guides. I'm sure with AI, we might be able to cut this down. They might be able to, we will be able to quickly, as soon as we design the guide, see if they are really safe right away before, because it was scary for us because it's like after like 5 years I'm working on the project. Now we are testing the safety. I'm like, oh, shoot, if it's not safe now, I'm like, what do I do? Fortunately, it is. But we have to test them right away. And that's what I was talking with this company. I said, you have to find a way to make it cheap enough that when the people start their project, they can test their guide for the safety. And I'm sure AI will be involved in that.
Yeah, I think that AI, is really important when it comes to how is AI useful in this context, right? It's going through all this information that a human sitting there going through papers can't, right? So like in terms of like trying all possible scenarios to create like the optimal enzyme to create an edit, like absolutely, that's a great idea. There's also companies like, there's a company called Dino Therapeutics, for instance, who's creating very, very specific AAV vectors to target different subpopulations of the brain so that we can do very, very specific gene therapy only in specific cell types, right? So, we don't know what will happen if you just inject something into the brain and you affect all the different cells, but maybe you can limit some of the damage or potential harm by being able to only target the cells, like let's say in Parkinson's, which are the dopamine producing cells. Like, can you just hit those ones and have an effect there? I think that's a great use of AI. And in order to do that, they're doing this like virtual evolution to create viruses that we would never, maybe we would see in millions and billions of years on this planet, but we can do it in a computer in 10 minutes.
Yeah, in vector design. Actually, I can just want to say a word is that actually, we have, I'm the director of a gene therapy initiative at UCSD, and Betty is the operating director. And actually, we are very interested in the AI, and we are ready to fund actually, projects on using AI for gene therapy, for designing vector, for the safety, for anything. So we are very supportive of that. So if you know any team.
Hi, so I had a question. I'm Ranveer. I'm a cell and molecular bio major here in my undergrad. I wanted to ask, what are some technological challenges you guys see from bridging from rare to common diseases? And then also on that, so to like go from rare to common diseases would require a lot of genome sequencing of a large population. Who's going to manage all that data, that personal private data? I mean, obviously, with all the other challenges with AI, we've seen that private companies can't be trusted with, just handling large amounts of data. They're just going to train their models on it. How do you tackle like using such personal data and maintaining the privacy and rights of people in regards to their genomic data for gene therapy?
I mean, it's a very good question, especially the cost of sequencing is like, I just did a test where you can get it. I got my whole genome sequence for $400, right? It's the cost of sequencing is not going to be the rate limiting factor here, and so you make a very, very good point. I don't really have an answer besides saying that like this is a very actively real problem, and we're seeing it also with like the 23andMe kind of fallout, right? So 23andMe, the company behind Ancestry.com and those sorts of like tests, has been bought out, and so people's data now is being handed over to someone else, and those people didn't have any say in that, so how do we avoid things like that? It's more pertinent now than ever.
Yeah, so I think it's a really big question, and I kind of like the patent question, which I think maybe we disagree a bit about that, but we can talk about that later. I think the way the data privacy, the way to address the data privacy problem is to change the way we think about and the rules around ownership of data, and move away from a model whereby we allow ownership of data, and move to a model where we think about what kinds of processing of data and uses of data are permissible or impermissible. Because now, at least in certain ways, data is treated almost like an object, right? Where if you own the data, it's not unlimited, but you have a lot of flexibility with how you use that data within certain kinds of very broad constraints. And the problem there is that often doesn't account for the ways in which, the emerging ways in which that data could be used in the future, right? So I'll give you one quick example. A while ago, some scientists discovered that you can actually figure out, you can sort of swab a room and get DNA from the room, and you can use this DNA to get a sense, as initially biologists, you can have a sense of what animals have been in this environment by the DNA that's left behind. Of course, in the future, as more and more people sign on to, 23andMe type services and their genomes go into these databases, soon you might be able to identify what individuals have been in a room based on the sort of found DNA, right? But of course, when you consent to have participate in 23andMe or have your genome sequenced, you might not be aware this is a possibility. That might not be something in the terms, the terms, the 1,000-page document that everybody reads very carefully, I know, before clicking I agree at the bottom. And so I think the way to handle this problem is to just change the model and restrict what people can do with data and have that separate from ownership of data, but use of data and processing of data.
So there's a question there, but one thing I just wanted to say, oh yeah, right here, so there are always going to be like nefarious actors, right? And one issue that I know that is important right now to like the US government, and I've spoken to people at BARDA, is that they're trying to figure out how can we create sensors in like airports and all sorts of stuff to detect engineered viruses. And, and coming back to who's been around and whatnot, like, can someone engineer a virus to very specifically target a certain population? It's not out of the realm of the possibility. So there's a lot of things of this nature that are currently being discussed, like at the military level and whatnot to protect people from, you know, biochemical or biological warfare in this case. So.
Yeah, Chris Mason. I'm a serial entrepreneur and prof of cell and gene therapy. It's a really interesting discussion. Now, technologies on the whole get cheaper, easier to use, they're globalized, and they broaden their indications and applications. And I'm sure gene therapy, cell therapy will be no different. So the question really to the panel is, do we think it's never going to go into areas like aging, enhancement, cosmetic, or it will go there? In which case, what is the trigger points that takes it into those areas outside of disease or traditional disease?
Yeah, I mean, that's what, I was alluding to before. I think, we have to limit the use. I mean, from my point of view, we have to limit the use of gene therapy because it's still, again, playing with the genes. And I think if we start using gene therapy for really common disease or for, cosmetic, or I think then we are maybe not getting better than, using that as, an enhancement, at the end. So I think that, and that's what the FDA is for, the FDA, there is what they call the risk versus benefits. They will allow you to use gene therapy nowadays for a disease where the risk of gene therapy are, beyond the benefits that can the gene therapy bring to the patients. And I think that's, for me, what we should always follow, the risk versus benefits.
I also want to say that I do think we can hold the line. I don't think it's inevitable that this technology is going to end up getting used for purposes that we think are problematic. And I think there are examples of this, right? So, for example, human growth hormone treatment, right? If you gave it to pretty much anybody, you could make them bigger, better, stronger, faster. I can't remember the Daft Punk song. But we don't, right? We restrict that usage of it. It's not widely available for people who just want to increase the likelihood of their child being successful at American football or something silly like that. We have drawn the line, and we've kept the line. There are outliers, and people do abuse it, but by and large, that line has stayed firm. And so I think that's an example that might push back against this inevitability that we're all going to be, edited into Uber people at some point. Yeah.
So I do think that, and this kind of comes back to some of the questions about who's in charge here, right, and what's the right thing to do. And I do think it very much is an important time for not only for us to be looking at from like, okay, clinical trials are going safely and stuff like that, but right, it looks like we do, sounds like from here, and I believe also that there needs to be more of a, maybe perhaps a new institution or regulatory body that looks into the account of like the economic impacts of things. And when you talk about aging, right, the argument is always, well, if you can fight aging, which some people consider as a disease, can you then spend less money again, or are you spending more money because people are living longer? And people have done models actually that if they live longer, it actually boosts the economy in some models. In other models, it says the opposite, right? So there's a lot of really interesting questions that can be addressed here, and I think that perhaps some of this lies in an agreement of a tier system, right? In some ways, of we have rare diseases. Should everyone chip into that? We're all very lucky to be whoever we are and born into in this lottery of life. Should we get to live longer and whatnot? Maybe there needs to be I would support a movement within the government and even beyond, where people, ethicists, entrepreneurs, economists, legal people, scientists come together to be like, okay, well, this is what we can do with it. This is how we can help people, and these are the things we need to take into account. And I think we're there, right?
This is a little bit out of the topic, but anyway, I want to bring a clinical perspective to all of this. Yeah, I just, as I said, I want to bring a little clinical perspective to what we are discussing. And 2 or 3 questions before, somebody asked about the use of gene therapy for common diseases. And I think today is unrealistic to think that we could even start generating therapies for common diseases. Number one, because there are many genes involved. There's many interregulations between genes. There is an environment effect on all these networks of genes. And so I do think at this point, our knowledge is quite limited. And I don't think we are there yet. We are right now treating monogenic diseases, one gene that can be replaced and with a vector brought back and made functional in an individual. But I think that this talk of dealing with common diseases where gene therapy will be really great, we are very far from that. And we are very unrealistic of thinking of data collection and all of this. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
The investigation has to be pointed to figuring out how do genes work.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you that for all the reasons that there has not been advancements in gene editing, which largely has to do with people not making money, there are a lot of people and a lot of money working on how can we do gene therapy for common diseases. Because when you can cure 20 million people as opposed to 2, people are very, very interested. Novo Nordisk, which is, I think, the biggest or the second biggest pharmaceutical company in the entire world, has set up the Bioinnovation Hub in Boston. And their sole purpose, basically, is to create gene therapy and gene editing solutions for common diseases, metabolic diseases, cardiovascular diseases. So, like, there's more money to be made. So it is absolutely happening.
Yeah, I think a great example. I mean, Rebecca, you're totally right. It's like right now, what we know how to do is one gene, one treatment. But let's say if we talk about type 1 diabetes, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could find a gene therapy for that? The issue is that we don't understand the genetics of it. So that's, the underlying issue for a limitation, I would say, of gene therapy is that you need to know the gene. And you need to have one gene. If you start, dealing with several genes, then that's much more complicated. You cannot. We don't have the tools yet. But maybe one day, we could tackle, type 1 diabetes.
Before handing this to Reuven, this is one place where AI comes in because you can understand all the networks and look at what is the one thing you need to tweak to fix it all.
Also say, I mean, I agree that it's probably not tomorrow that we're going to be able to deal with the sort of multi-genetic disorders and things like that, or maybe not next week or next month or next year. But I do think there's value in thinking about these questions now and thinking about frameworks for answering them, because you don't want to be led by the technology. You don't want something to suddenly pop off, out of nowhere, and then you be left wondering, how do we deal with this now? So I think it is worthwhile to look ahead, even if we think that it's not on the immediate horizon, because you're much better off at putting in place better rules and guidelines if you've thought about it for a while than whether you're surprised by something. So there's definitely value there.
All right, so I think we are
yeah, we're out of time.
Over time.
All these very interesting discussions. I wanted to thank everybody for their very, great questions and insightful answers from our panelists. The Gene Therapy Initiative, again, is something that we encourage you, if you are interested in these types of conversations, you want to hear about the AI technology, we might be incorporating it in all these different diseases that might be, addressed to. Here's some information here about the Gene Therapy Initiative for our newsletter, our website, and our LinkedIn page. And also I want to do a quick plug. So Dr. Theodore Friedman, who I originally talked to you, is kind of like the father of gene therapy when he got the Japan Prize. He also just did a book, and it's going to be available here in a couple of months. It's The Origin and Development of Genetic Therapies, and it's pre-order on Amazon, so also giving you that available there, a little plug for our father of gene therapy. And with that, I want to hand it over back to Greg, if he's around, and if you want to make a...
Step out.
Okay.
all right.
Well, we want to thank the Office of Innovation and Commercialization for having us here, because this was really a treat to, again, hear your guys' questions and, take this back as food for thought. And, again, just thank you. And the panel is here if you do want to come up and ask some questions and meet them personally. Thank you.
Thank you.